Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Richard Cooper. For those of you who don't know me, President and CEO of NY Spin. Let me take a few moments to thank our sponsors. First, we'd like to thank Thoughtworks for hosting tonight's event. We'd also like to thank the following sponsors: CooperPresents.com, Pearson Education, O'Reilly Media, Our Back Publications, and our newest sponsor, Pragmatic Programmers. First, I guess he couldn't make it tonight, but I'd like to thank Gary Scharf, who suggested tonight's speaker. Brent Hurley is an Agile coach and the regional delivery leader for Eliason Group. He has instigated and completed multiple Agile rollouts for Eliason Group clients across a wide range of industries. Brent's work covers team, product, and organizational coaching, mentoring folks through adoption of Agile practices. He has worked with senior managers to assist them in realizing the business value of an Agile approach, not only with software development, but extending Agile and lean practices throughout an organization. Prior to working with Eliason Group, Brent had years of experience in a wide variety of industries in England, Europe, the United States, and Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, Brent Hurley.
Evening, everybody. So I am going to try to help you overcome some of the barriers to facing Agile adoption. And when I talk about Agile adoption, I mean trying to organize or trying to convert an organization from a very traditional way of working to a much more forward-thinking way of working, a much more flexible way of working, and basically something that adheres to the Agile principles. Now, I'm not going to go through all the Agile principles, but I might touch on some of them as we're talking. So that's me. I was actually going to present myself, but I don't really see the point now, to be honest. You all know exactly who I am, and I've even regrown my beard for tonight's event. I've lost a bit more hair, I think, but anyway, there you go. Yeah, so I am the regional delivery lead for Eliason. Eliason is undertaking a couple of engagements in New York at the moment, but also I actually oversee engagements in Jersey, or New Jersey, as I should call it properly. And we do a little bit in Pennsylvania as well, and obviously I have other regional delivery lead partners as we go up and down the East Coast. So that's pretty much what Eliason is, what Eliason does from an Agile point of view. I'll probably get told off for not actually advertising us very well, but there you go. So this is a brief sort of agenda as to what we're actually going to talk about. So the idea is that, you know, small is beautiful, and Agile is only allowed to happen in small organizations with small projects, which in purest terms is kind of true. I have lots of Agile coach friends, and they will tell you that, you know, from a purely Agile point of view, trying to do it in a large international bank is basically bunkum. You can't do Agile like that because of the command and control and the way that organizations like that actually function. So if you actually want to take a sort of a very pure Agile sort of attitude, then in some ways you will start to fall down in some larger organizations. My attitude is that if you're actually helping the organization to be more forward-thinking, to be more progressive, to actually work in a better way, then that's a lot better than traditional ways of working. And if we can start to break down some of those problems that they actually have, then I think that improving their processes wherever you're doing it is actually a better way of working rather than, you know, Agile utopia. And let's face it, it is difficult to do that. So I'm going to talk about why you might motivate yourselves for change, and also why you might talk to some of the senior leaders as to why change is not a bad idea. Talk us about some of the problems that we found and why those problems exist. I'm going to talk about the Kotter Change Model. Kotter Change Model is quite well known and how it's been adapted for sort of Agile transformation. And then there's a few things that I'm actually going to talk about how to actually go about an Agile transformation at a kind of a very sort of simplistic level. We all know that these things are different in different contexts, different organizations, different types of organization, different people. You know, everyone's got someone who doesn't want to be Agile in an organization. So what can we do about that person apart from taking them outside and doing something not very nice to them? I'm not advocating that, by the way, even though I do think it quite a lot. That's British humour. Some of the incentives for change. So, I mean, I don't know, Are you all undertaking an agile transformation? Are you in agile organizations now? Are you thinking about it? Has anyone actually gone through what I would describe as an agile transformation? Okay. No? Anybody thinking about it? Anybody here because they would like to try and kick one off? Okay. Good luck. So, I mean, one of the things that I've started to categorize some of the reasons why you might want to do an agile change. So the first one is stress. In large projects, let's think of a 9-month, a year project, okay? Your project manager will lay out a plan and they'll think of everything and they'll put it all down in a Gantt chart. I mean, I used to do this sort of thing. You know, I'm not that young, and so when you actually plan everything out, it all looks great. And then you engage a business analyst who does, you know, a bit of analysis, and they're great because they're very clever people and they think of everything that you need to think about. You give it to a developer, they write all their code, and because they're very good developers, they never write anything wrong. You give it to someone to test it, but you know that they're going to find it all good, and eventually you deploy it. And it all works to plan. It's all great. Life is good. Fortunately, what most organizations tell me, and I quote one of the project managers who I work with, he said, the larger the product or the larger the project, the bigger the heart attack you're about to have. The end of the project, you're going to have sleepless nights, you're going to have, you know, a terrible sort of experience. He said, but when we switched to Scrum specifically, which was in 2-week sprints, we kind of just had like a minor sort of increase in our heart rate every 2 weeks, because we knew that if it didn't go right, there was a chance that we could actually sort of address it later on and improve it later on. So instead of having sort of going to the gym and running a marathon, you're actually just going to the gym and sort of walking on the treadmill for 10 minutes. So that's why I say it sort of relieves the stress, because also you're getting nice checkpoints. If you're using some a time box methodology, then you're actually getting those sort of checkpoints. There's my Scrum Master at home. Personal satisfaction. If you're in a large waterfall project, and you know it's a team of like 15 or 20 people, I don't recall, and I've been creating software for about 25 years, very often someone even saying thank you, actually. Generally, people would actually moan and groan that you got it wrong. So the personal satisfaction is difficult. If you are in a very nice organization and they throw a party for you and they buy you a piece of pizza and maybe even a beer, then that's nice. That's a small amount of personal satisfaction. Generally, what happens in Agile is you're actually going to get a lot more of that, and it's going to be repetitive. Having a bit of fun. Okay, that's what we do. Well, that's kind of some of the things that we do when we're training and some of the things when we're coaching. The idea being that Agile should be an enjoyable experience. You should be communicating with people. You should be actually enjoying what you're doing. So why not have a bit of fun at work? You are there for 8 hours a day. I mean, you are there with people who you might not generally go and talk to, so you may as well actually try and make it a nice existence. Team satisfaction. You'll notice that I have tried very hard. I won a bet because I was able to put 3 pictures of Liverpool Football Club celebrating something in my presentation. So this is the first one. I'm going to call them out as we do them. Team satisfaction. It's an old picture, by the way. The idea being that we can celebrate together. Again, in a waterfall project, if your business analyst has moved off to another project, which often happens, then he's not there to, or she is not there to enjoy the team celebration. Generally speaking, the people who celebrate at the end of a traditional project are the ones who've done the bug fixing. The ones who've been in the room, in the trenches, fixing bugs, and that's pretty much as good as you're going to get. And the project manager. I used to make sure I was there for the celebration. Cycle time. So I'm just going to clarify the difference between cycle time and lead time, because there has been some sort of, you know, what is concept to cache. And really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about cycle time here is simply the amount of time it takes to make that production happen. In other words, to go from your requirement to your shippable software. Because let's face it, shippable software can sit there for months on end if you are of a mind to. No one's saying you have to release it there and then. It's a good idea to, because that's when you're going to get some value from it. But no one's saying you actually have to. Finally, good old American dollar. I should say a dead president, but we all know that Benjamin Franklin was never a president, which is why he actually appears here. I don't want to have any politicians in any of my presentations anywhere. Everybody thinks that Agile, unfortunately, is faster and cheaper. No? Well, I've got news for you. It's not. It might be earlier because you can get it to market earlier. But if you've got coders, if you've got testers, they're still going to go at the same pace. Where you might gain sort of efficiencies is if you're doing some of the XP stuff, automated testing, trying to build your quality first time around as opposed to having to do bug fixes many times over. So it could be earlier. And with regards to cheaper, well, that's a different point. If you're looking at a project per se, and you're not worrying about all the fixes, all the additional functionality that you missed that you've added in phase 2, then it will be cheaper. But most organizations, they look at the project to create the first version, and the first version is full of bugs, and no one ever worries about the second version. So it depends on how you measure money.
Right, but I mean, if you're doing in shorter iterations, you're also catching things a little earlier that in a waterfall environment, you would have had that plus version 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 thrown over the wall to QA group, and that's when the bugs, many of them would have been caught, and it would have been a lot more expensive.
Absolutely. It depends on how, like I said, it depends on how you measure money. If you get feedback on the first screen that you build, and somebody says the font's the wrong size, then for the next 20 screens that you're going to build after that, then you can change the font size. If you build the wrong font size in all 20 screens, then you've got to replace them. Most organizations, they don't actually measure that. They don't put that into cost, which is a fault of how you actually consider a project. And really, that's why in the Agile world, you think more of a product, because a product can be many projects. I'm not going to go into my PMI death of a project presentation at the moment, but that's kind of a fun one as well. To the PMI it is anyway. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about problems. When you're actually starting with an Agile team, there are no problems. I don't see any problems. You put 5 or 6 people in a room together and you tell them to start building things. I mean, that can't be very hard. The problem actually starts when you go into an organization, and I've been at a couple of organizations this week, where they actually make you do all of this. And how do you do that in the Agile world? So in actual fact, you know, with all due respect to Scrum, it doesn't mention anything about funding or anything about most of the things that are in there, because you'll work it out. But larger organizations, they require those things. Anybody here been audited recently? Okay. Were you doing an Agile project?
No.
Okay.
It's still painful.
Yes, absolutely. And all of these things are considered to be generally part of your audit. And that's, you know, an interesting scenario. Let's just describe it as that. I'm not going to get involved in audits because I have a client that's going through one. The reality is that when you actually start to go down the road of Agile, you can expect it to touch pretty much everything. And I mean everything, you really in the organization as well. We had a very successful rollout with one of our clients, and simply because the IT team were building in 2-week iterations, that started to then filter into the marketing team. And the marketing team were like, hang on a second, you're going to have this ready in 2 weeks? Well, we need to get our marketing stuff ready as well. Oh, okay, great. So what started to happen is this small organization, well, it's a large organization, this small department of the organization started to build in a cadence, and everybody got sucked into that cadence. From the legal team, marketing team, sales team, customer support team, they all needed to know when things were being produced, things were being released, and they worked to that same cadence. And it's kind of interesting that the whole organization got sucked into the same thing. And I actually think it was a good thing. I mean, you know, I promoted it. I actually told them to do it. So as far as I'm concerned, it was all good. But it's interesting that a whole organization does that. In Australia, Lonely Planet do everything with Kanban boards. You're not allowed to do a piece of work that's not on a Kanban board. Which is kind of interesting. Try telling that to your lawyer, who will charge you for it. That's English humor as well. I've been living in the US too long, and I don't have a lawyer or anyone wants to ask me. So again, when you actually start to think about one team, my honest belief is that if you can't make it work with one team, then you're really going to struggle with anything bigger than one team. Because the moment that you start to max or scale out with more than one team, that's when you're going to start to have to think about other things rather than 5 people in a room, a list of stuff to build, and then hopefully releasing it at the end of your time box. So the moment you start to add extra teams, you've got to think about multi-team coordination. And what does that look like? And there's some organizations, you know, like Spotify, they make up their own words for everything. So they have, you know, squads and tribes and guilds and all this sort of thing. And the nice thing is that they're actually thinking about all of these problems and actively putting it as part of their process. Really, it doesn't matter. You know, if you actually look at some of the bigger frameworks like SAFe and that sort of thing, they have communities of practice. Scrum has now got Scrum of Scrums. It's the same idea. It's cross-team communication, and that's what you need to have. Otherwise, you will start to work as a silo in a team, and teams will start to go in different directions. And if you leave technical people to go in different directions, trust me, one will take Angular and one will start to take React, and you'll have a big mess with regards to what you've actually got in your architecture. Now, the final thing is when you actually start to think about enterprise agility, if you're a team, let's say you're a standing team of 7 people, and you're starting to build at a certain cadence, then how does your performance appraisal stand up? Most people's performance appraisal is personal. So if I'm in a team that's not producing, but I'm working very hard, does that mean that I suffer? Or does that mean that the entire team suffers? Or does that mean that the one person who's not pulling their weight suffers? So there's a lot of things you have to consider. And that's just one of these aspects. When you start to fund a project, or I prefer it's a product, but if you start to fund projects, and you have a backlog which can shrink and grow depending on what you want to put in a release, what does that do to your audit, for example? So there's a lot of things that you have to think about. If you're outsourcing work to someone, an agency or something like that, if you're trying to build it in an agile way, in other words, we're seeing what's being built and then we're reflecting on it and we're giving feedback, what does that do to our fixed price contract? So there's a lot of things that we have to think about with regards to how we work in an agile way. And all I'm saying is that organizations have all of these problems. And if you don't start to think about some of these problems, then they'll come up and they'll raise their hand and say, this is a problem, and then you have to solve them. So here's a quick list of some of the reasons why organizations kind of stop doing any sort of change. And, you know, a lack of urgency. Yeah, it'll take care of itself, you know. Those 5 guys, they seem to be building something. That's fine. Well, you know, let's let them do that. When it comes to then thinking about their compensation and stuff like that, then, you know, we're leaving them out on a limb. Most organizations will start with an agile transformation. You might even hire a coach. I fully advise you to hire a coach. Whatever you're doing, hire a coach. And my rates are very reasonable. So you might hire a coach for 3 months, but what do you do after those 3 months? Get rid of the coach and it'll all take care of itself? Well, maybe it will, maybe it won't. If you're a good organization and you've taken on board a lot of things that you've learned and you're prepared to push this forward, then you will be able to carry on. If you're not, and you know, the coach becomes basically some sort of like, you know, nagging mother. I have had a nagging mother, I know how they'll work. Then when the nagging mother leaves, or the coach leaves, then you'll actually just go back to doing whatever you want to do and have yourself a dirty or untidy bedroom. Okay. The confusion aspect is kind of interesting. If you don't know why you're doing anything, in fact, if you don't really know why you're building anything, then you'll actually stop to do it. And that really kind of goes for anything. If you are forced to make a change, and you know, I have a very good friend of mine, Dan, he's like, if you don't ask people if they're enjoying this process, if this change of process, and it's forced on people, then they will resist it and they will try to do something else. So you have to engender that sort of feeling of belonging with regards to the change of the process as well. Failure to remove obstacles. If you find a problem and you do nothing about it, you'll have to kind of work with that problem. If you only have, say, for example, one QA environment and you have 15 teams, well, how are those teams ever going to put their code into that? Well, let's forget QA. Let's say an integrated environment. How are those teams ever going to be able to look at their code in an integrated environment if you've only got one? How are they going to be able to do it consistently, continually? Okay, so there's a lot of things that you have to address. If you've only got one environment, what will happen is you'll take it in turns. you'll have to schedule it, and then eventually you'll be basically back to waterfall. The last one's kind of interesting. As a Liverpool supporter, I do this a lot, is declaring victory too early. We've got this Agile thing licked. When unfortunately, Agile is a journey and you have to ensure that you're keeping the momentum of change going. I mean, like I said, you know, Spotify, even here at Thoughtworks, I'm absolutely certain that they will continually try to improve what they're doing. And that's key to anything that you're trying to do. If you're trying to make that Agile transformation stick, you've got to keep improving it. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the different types of obstacles and barriers that we have found. The first is technical. Okay, how do you build a product? Some of those XP things that you've read about, test-driven development. Yeah, that's easy, no problem, we can do that. How do you persuade the developer that knows that that believes they write perfect code and they don't need to put any sort of testing around it, that they need to start doing that? How do you tell a tester, QA person, tester, that they shouldn't have to, they can continually keep testing things and not to worry? Okay, there are many technical problems. The environments, I talked about the environments. So there's many technical problems that we find in organizations. Agile adoption, people, culture, mindset. If you're doing a Scrum planning meeting, you're doing a daily stand-up, daily Scrum, you're doing a product review and a retrospective, you're not necessarily being Agile. What you're doing is doing 4 meetings. Okay, it's a very different world. So until you can start to address that sort of mindset and that culture of improvement and continual improvement, then you're not going to start becoming Agile. You might go through the motions, you might do Scrum, but you're not being Agile. Organizational. What do you do with the functional heads of the BAs and the developers, the front-end developers and the back-end developers and the QA managers when you try to put them into a cross-functional team?
Don't forget the documentation.
Absolutely, of course. And the auditors. It's important that you address these problems. We've started to talk about the frozen middle. So on the ground, the teams are all happy with what's happening with Agile. Senior managers, they're getting whatever they're getting out of Agile. They're getting early delivery. They might be getting transparency because they know what teams are building. They can see the backlogs. If they want to, they can start looking at burn downs. They can start to understand the story of production. That frozen middle layer of managers, the ones who used to direct traffic, the ones who used to give tasks, make estimates for people, they're the ones who kind of feel a bit uneasy about what's happening. Because are they necessary? That's the big question. And the reality is that if they were necessary before, then that whatever role they were doing, whatever things they were doing, if they add value, then they're necessary now. The question is, are they adding value? Is sitting in a meeting adding value? You know, one of the things I see when I'm coaching some people is I say, can I have some time with you? And they're like, oh, I got back-to-backs 9 to 5. I'm like, well, when are you doing your job then? And it's an interesting thing. You know, a lot of people will spend an entire working day in meetings and feel that they've added a lot of value. They may have done if they've been making decisions and, you know, being helpful and, you know, creating solutions. But how much of that time could be done outside of a meeting? The final thing is, and I never thought I'd do it, is quoting Donald Rumsfeld in front of a group of people in New York City, is the unknown unknowns. And they're basically the things that you would never imagine would be a problem when you set out on change. And that could be a revolt from the middle managers. Who knows? It happens in organizations. We are not doing it. We're absolutely not doing this thing because it's going to affect our world and it's going to change the way we do business. How do you go about that problem? And, you know, really, where I say that a lot of our coaching comes in, like trying to proactively foresee some of the problems that you're going to have. And that's really what you need to do within an organization. You need to proactively see what are the problems we're going to have. We're going to string up 15 teams. Okay, great. We're going to have a scrum of scrums, a community of practice. We're going to start to cross-pollinate ideas across the teams. We're all going to have the the team's running at the same cadence. So we're going to start on Monday the 1st of January, and we're going to end our iteration 10 business days later. And come what may, we're all going to do the same thing. Great. What happens to your environments? You've got 15 teams all trying to put their code into integrated environments all at the same time, because if they don't finish their sprint, they have to stand in front of everybody and say, we didn't do anything.
It's like the tragedy of the commons.
Exactly. So that's what being proactively thinking about some of the problems that might happen. And it takes time to do that. You know, you should be allowed to reflect. If we do this, then what does that do? Who should own the product backlog? The traditional way is the product owner. Okay, great. Who should own the strategic view of the organization? Well, depends. Maybe the CEO, maybe the product manager or the product strategy group or whoever it is. I've seen organizations where the PMO does it, which generally becomes some sort of administrative type role. But it's about who is taking ownership of various things and what problems will they cause. Architecture groups, generally speaking, they're the ones who feel threatened by not having big design up front. Okay? So you have to proactively think about what's this change going to mean.
Well, I mean, other obstacles and barriers include other parts of the organization that you're dependent upon for project timeline now, servers or other kinds of things.
Yep. I mean,
we understand the urgency of an agile environment and just go, when I get it to you, then you can go and build your waterfall project on the totality.
Absolutely, and you know, they could be grouped into either organizational or technical. I mean, you know, it depends. If you're trying to do continuous delivery and you don't have any sort of tooling, you can always write scripts. You can write, you know, Perl scripts or AND scripts or whatever you want to do. But the point is, you need help probably to do that. And you certainly need permission to do it generally in organizations. So that comes then organizational as opposed to technical. And if you don't have the skills in your team, then maybe you might want to get the skills from somewhere, be that training, mentoring, whatever that looks like. Hiring a consultant, I don't know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Kotter Change Model. Okay. See, I'm old school. I haven't read since 1995, so one of these modern books for me. That's a joke. I have to read all sorts of books. So basically, the Kotter Change Model is an 8-step process to change generally, change in an organization. And what we've done is we've kind of adapted it for an agile transformation. So the Kotter Change Model starts with a sense of urgency, which, you know, is kind of where I started with trying to get some sort of like momentum. A pilot is a good way of getting a momentum, okay? Proving that one team will work is a good way of getting momentum. Getting the business and the technology to work together is a good way of getting momentum. From that point on, you've got to form a guiding coalition. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a guiding coalition specifically. But if you do not get buy-in from other parts of the organization, you will be left with your single team, generally speaking. And from there, we start to create some sort of transformation, a vision, a set of objectives, where you're trying to go with Agile. And that should change. As most things in Agile, it should actually evolve as you're doing it. Just because you write a vision on the 1st of January in 2014, don't expect it to still hold true in the 31st of December in 2016. Okay, a lot can change in 2 years. So therefore, be prepared to evolve what you're trying to get out of your Agile transformation. Empower the organization to remove obstacles. Okay, support the change and learning. Very important to actually allow people to learn. Learning by doing is part and parcel of what Agile is all about. But also giving people the opportunity to actually go out there, come to things like this, go to seminars, talk to other people in the Agile world. The Agile community is very large now, and there's a lot of things out there. So be prepared to let people do that. Establish baselines and review progress. If you establish a baseline, where are we now? And then you do it again, where are we in a month's time? And you start to see differences. That'll enable you to understand what change is doing. If you don't measure, and the French, I lived in Belgium for 8 years, the French are very good at measuring things. In fact, they measure things to the extreme at times. But the point is, while you're measuring things, you're actually understanding where were we and where are we now. And you can start to understand what that gap is and how that gap starts to work. So if we only have, and I'm going to bang on about environments for a little while, if we only have one environment and we suddenly have two, what does that do to our efficiency? How much more can we start to produce? How much more can we release as a result of it? And then if you want to get two, then you can start thinking about 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 until every team's got one. And then what is that doing to our efficiency? So if you measure these things, then you'll start to understand it. I talk about dream, data rules everything around me. If you start to put metrics around the things that you're doing, then you can start to understand how that works. If you make a decision based on numbers or information and data, it's much more hard to change than a decision that's based on simply feeling or opinion. It's kind of interesting if you actually try to do that. Anyone can debunk a decision based on opinion. My opinion is different to probably everybody's in this room. However, if we're looking at numbers, those numbers will point to a particular thing. So don't be scared of measuring things. Did I go through all of them? We'll talk about the Guiding Coalition. I think I'll talk about all of them in detail anyway. So put some things out about the Guiding Coalition. It's not one person, okay? If it's one person, that person can leave for various reasons. And in a case of enough managers not liking what that person is doing, they can actually extract that person from the project. I've heard enough stories about people going to work on emergency projects so that they don't interfere with anybody else's working life. Okay? So just be aware that a single person is very easy to sort of shun. So they should be a set of key influencers. They should also be a set of experts in their particular field. Okay? If you have a technical problem, don't give it to a business, a marketing person to solve. Okay? If you have a problem of how do we involve marketing into the Agile transformation, which would be a long way down the road, then you probably don't want to be talking to the head of IT. Okay? So use the experts where they need to be used. People should have credibility. They should have a certain amount of respect. An XP principle is respect. So these people should have credibility and a certain amount of respect. Ideally, they should be leaders. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the CEO and all of the C-level management. They may be leaders, but they also may not be leaders. I see plenty of C-level people who are not leaders. So leaders come in all shapes, sizes, or forms. A leader is somebody who people are prepared to follow and prepared to influence by. So therefore, the Guiding Coalition should consist of leaders, people who can actually make change happen. And finally, it should be what I describe as a sufficient size. In other words, not a single person. But that doesn't mean it should be 40 people either. I believe as you become more agile, the Guiding Coalition will change. As you lead into more initiatives or different types of initiatives, that Guiding Coalition can change as well. Okay? As you concentrate on technical things, bring in more technical people. As you concentrate in more sort of HR things, use some HR people. Okay? Okay, retain the urgency and focus. That's just a picture of my Scrum Master. The idea is that as you get bogged down, it's very easy to stay bogged down. And really what we want to try is continually have that momentum. What we start to say is, what we say in Eliasson is, if you are not moving forwards, then you're moving backwards. So at the moment you actually feel as if you're not moving forwards, then the chances are you've actually started to regress. Now, depending on what you consider to be regression, the chances are you've gone back to habitual ways of working. Until you are habitually becoming agile, until you are habitually trying to improve what you're doing, trying to include everybody, having a flat management structure, etc., then chances are that you will start to go back to the way that you've traditionally had things. Okay, someone mentioned documentation. So I'm going to write a little bit about documentation here. This is what we believe that you should actually start to put together at the start, not necessarily at the start of a transformation, but as you're going through a transformation. So what are you trying to achieve? And again, this is not static. It should be socialized, but it certainly should not be static. What are you trying to achieve? How are you going to measure what you're trying to achieve? Start to think about what you can measure. We went to a large bank a couple of years ago and they said to me, we've got a bit of a problem here. I was like, oh, okay, so what's happening? Well, we're measuring 4,000 things for our agile teams. We have 4,000 data points. We can't quite find the one that works. I took a bit of a deep breath and I said, I'm not surprised, but you know, the reality is that you need to measure a range of things, but 4,000 is far too many. Okay, so concentrate on a set number of metrics that you can interchange. You don't have to stick with the same set of metrics for the entire Agile transformation. Create a vision. What are we trying to achieve? Put a time horizon in that vision as well. What are we going to achieve in the next quarter? What are we going to achieve in the next 6 months? Okay, something like that. List your initiatives. List all the things that you probably need to do to achieve that vision. So in the next 3 months, to achieve a more continuous delivery cycle, what are the things that we need to kick off? Who do we need to involve? What should the makeup of our guiding coalition be? Finally, you can break that down into actions. Who's going to be responsible for those actions? Who's going to own those actions? And eventually you can create them into tasks. And you can then divide the tasks up into whoever's involved in the transformation and see what they can do. Okay, so at Eliasson we have, you didn't think you were going to get away with not a small amount of selling. So I apologize now, but I have to do this type of thing. So at Eliasson we have what we call our Agile Maturity Matrix, which is 50 out-of-the-box metrics. And it's a way of measuring your organization. We actually go at the team level and the organization level. They're broken down into these 6 areas. The idea being that at the end of each sprint, or if it's every 2 sprints, depending on how you would do, but I wouldn't go for very much longer than that, you reassess the teams. Now, some teams will move forwards and some teams will move backwards. So, for example, one of the engineering practice measures is how much test coverage you have. I think it's in unit tests and in UI automated tests. I can't remember exactly. So if you are a big fat 0, you don't have any unit tests. If you're a 4, then you have, I don't know, 90% coverage of unit tests. Now, if you get a team that's at 4, then great, that's good. But if that team then suddenly decides to stop writing their unit tests, or more importantly, stop running their unit tests, because there's no point in having a test if you don't run it, then they go back to 3, 2, or maybe even a big fat 0 if they're not running them. So that's why it's important to keep measuring. You might think you've got the organization working on a 4, but it's very easy to move backwards. And that's why keeping this measuring and keeping the cadence of measuring is a good thing. I think these measures are on our website, aren't they? All these measures are on our website. There you go. Bit of free work for you there. You didn't think you were going to get much for free tonight, did you? Apart from pizza and a drink. There you go. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that there while I talk about a little bit about the representation. We've made radar charts as kind of a way of representing them. And one of the reasons why we've done that is because we can actually start to overlay teams upon teams upon teams. So you can have one team as blue, another team as green, purple, orange, blah, blah, blah. And that gives you a sort of an overview as to how all the teams are getting on. And allows you to do a fairly simple compare and contrast over the teams. So what we don't have here is a sort of a historical sort of way of looking at it, but you could also lend in a historical way of looking at it, how the teams are moving over time. There you go. There's a bit more about Agile maturity indicators. There's just some examples of the indicators. When we actually use the matrix, it's all kind of self-explanatory. It explains where you are at stage 0, where you are at stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that's why you can easily grade the teams. So it's kind of quite a simple thing to do. Okay, so how to do a transformation? Anyone got any ideas how to do a transformation? How are you doing your transformations? Okay, I've got an idea how to do a transformation. I call it the bull in the china shop transformation. What happens is everybody in the organization goes into a room, they get trained by me for 2 days, which is actually a very enjoyable experience, and then the next Monday morning, everyone's agile. Moo, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way of starting. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly walk through let's some of you might already spot this, but we're going to talk about creating an Agile zone for Agile transformation. As an Agile coach in an Agile practice, doing an Agile transformation, I think it's only fair that I should actually do it in an Agile way. If I suddenly did it in a waterfall way, you might go, that's not quite right there. You're doing it in a waterfall, big bang style way, and you're an Agile coach. So we do it in an Agile way. So what do? We start with a pilot. We extend the pilot. We hopefully take on a larger project or a program. We start to run through our problems of a program. We then start to scale across an organization, maybe a line of business in a big organization. When we run through our problems with the big organization or the line of business, then we start to scale it out.
So I'm being for real here, you would not recommend starting your first Agile project as a large, visible project?
Well, visible projects are good because you get the organization's senior leadership involved.
No, but I mean a big, important, large project as your very first Agile project.
I would be cautious about doing that.
Class.
I would be cautious about doing that. The question I would ask is, what are the other options? And if that's the project and the organization is like a big project organization, then why not? I'd advise you to get help, though, if you're going to do it for something that's important, costly, multiple teams, program-style project, and potentially you're going to be audited. But yeah. I mean, my attitude, and you'll see that with the photos of Liverpool Football Club, is celebrate your victories. And if you can't get a sort of a beachhead into what Agile can bring and get other parts of the organization to start to understand what Agile is, you're putting yourself out there for risks. That's all I would say.
Sorry. But you raised a question about even before you can start your first Agile, you need someone to be your champion for this in an organization that is waterfall. You need someone who's senior enough that he sponsors the introduction of Agile into the organization and people will pay attention to it.
I think if you're officially putting it on the roadmap of an organization, then yes, you would need some sort of sponsorship. But there's plenty of organizations you will find, and I did it when I was quite young. You would be a project manager or hired as a project manager, and you would then say, well, hang on a second, I'm going to run this as a cross-functional team. We're going to build it in very small increments, and we're going to actually build shippable code at the end of those increments. Now, that maybe means that you can't use words like Scrum, and you maybe can't use words like Agile, but you can start to engender that idea of small increments, small shippable increments, which you can then start to then show to the organization as potentially shippable product, and you can then start to show what this means. At that point, if people start to like what they're seeing, and lots of business people do like to see things as they're being built, then you can start to say, well, this is actually an attempt to be Agile in a big waterfall environment. So it can actually happen bottom up quite easily. It's just that you'll bump up against problems. If you then say to the organization, hey, and I need an integrated environment for myself or for my team, someone will say, why? And then you need the sponsorship to help you overcome that barrier. Right. And what will happen is as you get more and more sort of larger barriers, that's where you need help with that sponsorship, and that's why the Guiding Coalition is a group that will help sort of smooth out some of those barriers. Okay. So the first thing I suggest you do is establish some roles. As you start to do an Agile transformation, lots of people will have lots of questions. Can I get trained? Can I do it this way? Can I do it that way? How am I going to go this way? Blah, blah, blah. So create a transformation product owner. Okay. Now, the nice thing about being a product owner is you get lots of requests. It doesn't matter if you're building a product or if you're actually doing a transformation, you get lots and lots of requests. So you're never short of work to do. However, that's not really very helpful. So you need a certain amount of support. You need a certain amount of understanding as to what you should actually prioritize. So therefore, you have to have some sort of process. So this is basically the process that I'm suggesting. You start to establish a transformation backlog. You might even consider those transformational actions to be ready. And why not ready, then why not done? Pass them to your transformational group, your coalition, or at least the people who can actually make these requests happen. Why not put them on a board? That's a Kanban board. Celebrate your wins. You may even document what you've done. Most importantly, you should hire a coach. So as you can see, that is an agile process. That backlog can change as you see new problems, and why shouldn't it? It can be flexible, and that'll allow you to actually solve your problems as they arrive. Now, how do you get these problems into the backlog? Well, your teams will give you plenty of problems. Senior managers will give you plenty of problems. But there should be no shortage of where you need to solve these problems. Who can solve the problems are generally the people in the organization. I mean, I could, or any coach could probably come to an organization and say, we've seen this happen and this happen and this happen, and it's been successful. But that's with different people, different businesses, different processes, different all sorts of things, different contexts, as I like to say. So one of the things that I'm going to warn you about having lots and lots of things happening at the same time, okay? We talk about minimal viable increments at Eliason, and that is basically a way of defining ourselves from a creation of a minimal viable thing that's not very good. So an increment is something that adds value, quite simply. So in your agile transformation, what we're doing is we're creating small, viable increments of value to the transformation. And you should break them down to smaller pieces. As you break them down into smaller pieces, you can effectively fuel the next increment. As you save time, you can actually use that time in the transformation for the next thing. Okay? The other thing that I'm going to warn you against is having too many initiatives happening at the same time. I challenge you tomorrow morning to try to brush your hair and brush your teeth at the same time. I guarantee you'll have to do one of them again. I do it every morning just to see if I can suddenly start to do it. I haven't been successful. I've been doing it for 5 years. Though brushing my hair is becoming easier. The point is that it's difficult to concentrate on two things at the same time. You know, Kanban is all about work in progress and limiting that work in progress. And it's the same thing. If you have many initiatives going on at the same time, you'll be ramping up and ramping down. You won't actually complete them. So that's why you should limit those initiatives. The other thing is if you concentrate on those initiatives, you can start to get the value out of those initiatives. If you're able to create scripts where you can do automated deployments, then that time you save, you can use somewhere else. And that's very key. Kind of the last thing I'm going to talk to you about is rotating the focus. Unfortunately, even though you might have 50 indicators, and all those 50 indicators are that we need to do, you know, everything at the same time, you should probably be focusing on maybe one organizational thing, then something technical, then something to do with the process, maybe something to do with the team and the structure and the organizational structure. So you're actually showing wins in different parts of the organization as you're doing your agile transformation. If you concentrate solely on, say, technical, and you get everything technical to be perfect, but you haven't got any organizational buy-in and you haven't shown any wins to anybody else beyond, you know, the 5 or 6 developers who are having a great old time, then you'll start to have problems with the organization. They'll start to say, what's in it for me? So that's why it's an important thing to rotate the focus around what Agile can bring to different parts of the organization. Okay, the last thing is stop drowning. That's the second picture of Liverpool. Okay. I said I'd call it out to you. It's to stop drowning and celebrate your wins. Okay? Every time that something is good, you should show it to the senior management. You should show them how you're improving the process and what it's bringing to you, what is the value. As they start to see those wins, they'll start to get more and more momentum, and that'll start to help you out. Finally, that's a checklist. That's kind of the things that I have talked about, and I'm going to give you the deck. I think it's going to be available, so you can see that checklist. And that's what I would suggest, or we would suggest, that you start to instigate as you're doing your Agile transformation. It's all freely available. Okay, it's pretty much a summary of all the things that I've talked about.
I have a question about audit. Some artifacts have to be approved by the regulatory body. Now, the artifacts associated with Agile, in your experience, how has that been adopted by audit and regulatory perspective?
So, my attitude towards auditing is it depends what you're auditing against. If you're running an Agile project and you are therefore writing Agile documentation, for want of a better way of describing it, in other words, user stories and acceptance criteria and the metrics that go around with burn down charts and progress and maybe even doing release planning and that sort of thing, that doesn't map to a traditional project where you're doing auditing against that. And if your baseline is waterfall, then it doesn't matter what documentation you're going to produce with regards to how you would run an Agile project, it will not map. So depending on what you actually are expected from your audit, you are probably going to have to produce those documents, unfortunately. So the question I'm going to pose back to you is, what documents are expected?
Well, what I was saying, where I was working on the waterfall, but some of my projects were into Agile because they were components. So there would be certain documents that we had to work with for the engineering board to approve. For the Agile, I think they create some compromise. They had to get special approval from the board in order to proceed with those artifacts. Agile is new in that environment. They have strict regulatory requirements. So I was just curious as to how it works in your case if you came up with, causing a thing like that.
I have, and depending on how many people have got to sign off, I mean, I don't know the exact regulatory sort of, work that you're talking about, but I mean, I've worked in governmental project or really programs, and in some ways you have to kind of go back to what is your documentation expected to produce, and a lot of it is kind of documenting after the fact, which is slightly annoying because you've already produced your product, you've already proved it works, you've already got it in the hands of the client, and then you get an audit, and so you have to document after the fact, which is wasteful in my opinion. So, if you have to do that, then that's what you have to do, because unfortunately, a lot of regulatory audits are expected to be against a particular set of standards, and if you want to adhere to those standards, you have to produce those standards. I don't really have any, I wouldn't create those documents as you're trying to build your product, because you want to move quickly to building your product, but you can then, if you have to, document after the fact. Don't forget, code is still a good form of documentation, but few people are going to sign off on code, let's put it that way.
So if you're a consultant, how do you account for time spent documenting to satisfy regulatory requirements?
In exactly the same way you would writing code. You would have to put it into your team, and your team would have to produce those documents.
Some of the things that we've done is if certain documentation is required for a specific user story, we'll include that as a task for the user story.
Yeah, it can be part of your definition of done.
And I'm an architect, half time, and coach the other half, and a lot of the architectural artifacts we'll whiteboard, and then we will take a picture of that whiteboard, and that's good enough. But you have to work with your audit board, with your architectural review board, the engineering board, say, okay, look, here's our picture, this is our diagram, and here's the snapshot, and just make sure that they can read it, number one, and that it's acceptable. I have yet to have anything that I've done, whether it's stickies, post-it cards, or anything, taking pictures of that where they have not accepted it. But you just have to explain, they have to understand the process.
I mean, the thing, if you're using a lot more paper-based, then I would regularly take photos. I mean, if you take a photo kind of as an example and then don't take a photo for another 6 weeks, and people say, well, what was your backlog after the first sprint and the second sprint, and you don't have any evidence, then that's problematic. Yeah.
So in your initial meeting with the stakeholders and sponsors, you also have one of the audit team on board, right? Someone that's
Sure.
Yeah,
That's
well,
part of your crime. That's
yeah.
part of the acceptance criteria,
Yeah.
right? It has to pass the audit, so
Yeah.
that becomes your acceptance criteria of that user story, and you define that.
I mean, I worked for a government project in like 2003 before everybody had smartphones with photos on them, and we would literally whiteboard, and then the person who actually came last to the meeting had to write down the whiteboard and then clean it off. Yeah. Well, that was his fault or her fault. That wasn't my fault. Yeah, it was part of the team's working agreement. I didn't make it up. Someone made it up. I don't believe it.
Also, I feel like if you are working in a regulated environment where things have to be documented before the transition kicks off, part of the transition you have to define how are you meeting your requirements, how are you meeting your audit requirements, right? One of the companies that I worked for, they actually created an entire set of documents that came from Agile teams to satisfy the FDA regulations. And they had to be standardized, the format had to be standardized, application and so forth. But as an organization, we defined this is how we're going to handle this. And we got the approvals and moved forward. So it's just a matter of making sure everybody's on the same page.
Yes, I have a fascination with the maturity levels, whether it's software development, project management, business intelligence. I'm aware of about 10 or 12 of them. So I was very intrigued when you spoke about maturity levels and 50 indicators. I was thinking maybe you've done this. You could structure those 50 indicators into levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. Is that
that's how they're organized.
In fact, you need to be 3 out of 4 for 10 indicators to be at level 1, and 3 out of 4 for the next for 20. Is that what are you doing?
Oh, okay, that's interesting. And what we actually do
establish the actual escalation levels from 1 to say 5.
Yeah, the way we actually work it is we set with the Guiding Coalition, we set targets for, and it works both ways actually. We set targets as to what we would expect in a particular time period. So, in a month or 2 months or 3 months or something like that, not years out. So, a short time period. And that enables the client then to understand what is happening with the coaching. It allows us to focus the coaching into a particular area. So, for example, more technical or organizational or whatever it looks like it needs to be. And that allows, the client to judge us and us to sort of judge the client, really, for want of a better way to say it.
But are you using the full set of 50, or are you working in subsets?
There will be they will be in subsets based around the target. So some of them will be a target of 2 or 3, and some of them will just be left as a target as 1 or whatever they're at the moment. It might just be and that's simply so we understand what we're trying to work towards.
As a function of context or project, or is it generic?
It will depend. We generally do it more at the team level or the program level or the organizational level.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, there's some reading. The most important thing on this page is my Twitter handle. And I'll tell you for why, because my wife and I started Twitter at the same time last year, and she's got 650 followers and I've got about 50. Which is highly annoying. There you go. Oh, there you go. I told you I'd get 3 in, didn't I? I'm joking. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. More questions? Go ahead.
So at what point do you interject a cultural assessment?
Anybody want to be in the rifle?
I do Kotter as well, but I also, before I do Kotter, because that's 8 steps organizational change,
Yeah.
I also incorporate Schneider's core culture assessment in there.
Yeah.
And I look at their 4 quadrants, and then that can tell me the 8 changes that I can start working those 8 processes.
Yeah, I mean, really what we're actually doing is we're layering a couple of the different models. when we actually do discovery and health check, and that's when we start to layer in those models as well.
Okay.
And that's really what, the appetite for change, where we think we can actually have our biggest bang for our buck, and that's where we start to do that sort of cultural change. And they're at set ideally they're at set points during the transformation, and we'll do discovery and health checks at those points, and it's a more in-depth sort of look at it.
What's the biggest, in your experience, what has been the biggest hurdle or the biggest reason that the transformation has? So like it started, everyone's enthusiastic, and then it's sort of like either it becomes its own little...
Yeah, I would describe it as, a sort of a lack of urgency. In other words, things are not moving forward. And similarly, senior management, either through change of the senior management or through the senior management simply getting bored and moving on to something else, that has impacted that lack of urgency. And that's what I think is, it's kind of becomes a stagnation, and the stagnation effectively, everything kind of stops.
So what if say I'm the bank executive and I take you on for 3 months as a coach, and then you're out the door and I experience this level of stagnation or non-enthusiasm? Do I get you back in, or I mean, after you're gone, what do you leave us with?
Well, we'll leave you with things like the Agile Maturity Matrix, which you can start to, and a lot of learning. But the reality is, an engagement should be more like a long-term engagement, even if it's not full-time. I mean, it shouldn't be full-time after a certain point in time. So you may need a lot of sort of help at the start to get you through some of the certain hurdles. But after that, it should be a much more, it's a bit like, no disrespect, but it's a bit like having children, You look after them day in, day out for a certain amount of time. After a small amount of time, you send them to school. They have to stand on their own 2 feet, but you're there when they need help. And then after a certain amount of time, they don't want your help, and they get rid of you, in fact. So, well, they do. And it's the same idea. I don't mean to mean that you're a child.
There's a lot of mainframes that it was even hard for me to get a waterfall project through. Much more an agile project. And a lot of their core systems were mainframes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, technology plays a part. Try telling a COBOL programmer that they've got to write unit tests. There's always one. Thank you.
But as a coach, don't you sometimes find that you're working with people and you find you're St. Peter before you ascend? Who's going to lead, or who's going to lead the church after?
Of course. Yeah, of course. You should, really you should be identifying that sort of succession. Absolutely. I mean, that's part and parcel of why, organizations, they might even create a sort of an agilist or someone who's going to lead that, that effort once I ascend. I like that one.
I don't know why a lot of biblical flashbacks are coming through. Like picking your 12 apostles at the Galilee for Scrum.
And see, one of the things that I do is I impress upon my clients that choosing the right Scrum Master is invaluable, because when I go away from being full-time into a part-time on-call, that Scrum Master typically will pick up the role of a coach. Mm-hmm. So you need to really be choosy about who you select as your Scrum Master, and it needs to be somebody that's really motivated and they really want to do that, because that's your coach once we leave.
They have to be motivated and can be motivated.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that, again, you've got to be very picky. There's a certain type of personality, and it's that true servant leader. It's not that I'm the hero, I'm the boss kind of thing. It's a real servant leader where they just, it's in their soul to do that.
Any more questions? Okay, well, thank you very much.